second summit? After a firestorm of criticism, President Trump invites Vladimir Putin to the White House this fall. Assisted suicide. We talk with a lawmaker who's trying to repeal a euthanasia law in Washington, D.C. Widening scandal. A bishop in Honduras is the latest high-ranking clergy member to resign due to allegations of sexual misconduct. Royal welcome. A member of Japan's imperial family visits an iconic statue in Brazil. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, July 20th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. President Trump provokes more criticism for inviting Russian President Vladimir Putin to the White House this fall. The news appeared to catch even the president's top intelligence official by surprise. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. National Intelligence Director Dan Coats blames Russia for election meddling and ongoing cyber attacks. He was caught off guard when a journalist told him President Trump invited the alleged mastermind of those attacks to Washington.
We have some breaking news. The White House has announced on Twitter that Vladimir Putin is coming to the White House in the fall.
Say that again?
Vladimir Putin coming
Did I
to
hear
the...
you? Did I hear you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's going to be special.
Coats also admits he doesn't know what President Trump discussed Monday in his private meeting with Putin. The only other people in the room in Helsinki, Finland, were two translators. Coats says he wishes President Trump had made different statements at the joint press conference that followed when he appeared to support Putin's denial of Russian interference in the 2016 election.
It's undeniable that the Russians are taking the lead on this. Basically, they are the ones that are trying to undermine our basic values, divide us with our allies. They are the ones that are trying to wreak havoc over our election process.
Thank you, everybody. Yesterday...
Coates says it was important to express support for the intelligence professionals he represents, and he's happy the president later clarified his statement. Russia says it's open to Trump's invitation to the White House, but so far President Putin has not accepted. He last visited the White House in 2005 when he met President George W. Bush. Wyatt?
Mark, shifting gears to a faith-based issue, what is the status of the White House's office that works with faith-based groups?
A White House official tells me an advisor to the White House Faith and Opportunity Initiative will hopefully be appointed by September. I'm told the White House is honing in on one particular person. The president announced the initiative in May, saying that faith-based groups are key to helping communities.
This office will also help ensure that faith-based organizations have equal access to government funding and the equal right to exercise their deeply held beliefs.
The president speaking on the day he signed an executive order to establish the White House Faith and Opportunity Initiative. The office will attempt to provide faith-based organizations with the tools it needs to carry out their mission. The White House wants to have this office up and running in the next couple of months. We will keep following this as new information develops. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. The House votes to repeal Washington, D.C.'s assisted suicide law, which went into effect last summer, but the battle is far from over for pro-life lawmakers. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi has that story. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. The District of Columbia has its own council and laws, but Congress has the power to strike those laws down. The House last year and this year has moved to gut D.C.'s assisted suicide law, but the measure stalled in the Senate last year. The pro-life Republican is trying once again and hopes this year will be different.
That it sends a very bad signal when the government says it's okay to take the life of another human being.
Congressman Andy Harris, who's an anesthesiologist, is leading the fight against D.C.'s assisted suicide law.
Once again, in the bills that control the District of Columbia, we're attempting to withhold any funding from supporting that law. We don't think that assisted suicide is appropriate. We have control of the District of Columbia. We think it's appropriate for us to tell D.C. they cannot enforce this law.
The D.C. Council passed the bill in 2016 with an 11-2 vote.
I also am aware of others in the community, but also others who have come into the District of Columbia to share their stories, how urgent it is for them and their families to be able to have this choice.
That choice is now available for residents of the district who have less than 6 months to live. They can ask their doctor for death-inducing drugs. Some of the loudest critics of the law are people with disabilities, like Elaine Kolb.
We are told over and over that we'd be better off dead, that that we're a drain on the economy, that they're wasting money on us, that they could be doing better things with. You're a burden on your family.
Around the country, 6 states allow physician-assisted suicide, and Hawaii is set to do the same in 2019. Representative Harris says it's time to end this national trend.
The bottom line is you shouldn't put your physician in the position of giving you drugs to end your life, because we all took the Hippocratic Oath. Hippocratic Oath says we're going to preserve life, not take it.
The repeal is part of a broader appropriations bill that would also stop D.C. funds from going to abortion. Now, the Senate's version does not include the repeal of the D.C. assisted suicide law. It is a long shot, but still possible that the final bill could include it. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thanks, Jason. At least 17 people are dead after a tourist boat capsizes in southern Missouri. The vessel, packed with tourists, sank last night in Table Rock Lake in Branson. Investigators blame stormy weather and high winds for the accident. Children are among the dead. The Coast Guard and National Transportation Safety Board are investigating. Russia releases a video showing the test launch of an updated missile defense system. The country's military is testing an array of nuclear and other weapons. They include a cruise missile, which Moscow says has unlimited range. The new weapons were unveiled in March during a speech by President Vladimir Putin. Rebels in southwest Syria have given up their fight against government forces. 50 buses are taking the opposition fighters to northwest Syria. When finished, the evacuation will put Syria face-to-face with Israel along most of its border for the first time since fighting started in 2011. That's when the uprising against President Bashar Assad's rule swept through the country. North Korea is threatening to call off a reunion next month of families separated by the Korean War. Before the meeting, the communist regime wants the South to return 12 women who fled North Korea in 2016. The North says they were kidnapped. Seoul says the women resettled of their own free will. President Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua is attacking the Catholic Church in his country for its support of anti-government protests. Ortega is accusing the church of being allies to coup mongers. His remarks come after 3 months of protests. Bishop Silvio Baez is firing back on Twitter. He says slander doesn't hurt the church. He says the church suffers for the nearly 300 demonstrators who have been killed since the violence began in April. Pope Francis has accepted the resignation of a Honduran bishop accused of sexual misconduct with seminarians. Bishop Juan Jose Pineda was an auxiliary in the Archdiocese of Tegucigalpa. Here we see him meeting with the Holy Father in September of 2017. His resignation is the latest in a series of high-ranking clergy implicated in sexual scandals with adults under their authority. Edward Penton, correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us from Rome. Edward, what is the bishop accused of exactly, and what's the background to this case?
Okay, this relates to Bishop Pineda, who's the top deputy of Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga, who's one of the top advisors to Pope Francis on church reform. Bishop Pineda is accused, or has been at the center of allegations of sexual misconduct and financial misconduct. On the sexual misconduct, that relates to seminarians primarily, and we at the Register obtained 2 testimonies from seminarians confirming this and confirming the allegations against him. There are also allegations of sexual relations, intimate relations with male lovers in Honduras and abroad. But also on the financial side, he allegedly gave lavish gifts to these people, but also secured a $1.3 million donation from the Honduran government, which then completely disappeared. So there's quite serious, obviously very serious allegations leveled against him.
So give me a sense of the timeline here, Edward. Why did the resignation come now?
Right, yes, these allegations have persisted for quite some time. They came to light last year with a papal investigation which was carried out last year by a retired Argentinian bishop. But I think the resignation has come now simply because primarily the laity, I think, have been very concerned about this and have put pressure on the hierarchy and on the Vatican for action to be taken. So I think that's primarily why the resignation has come now.
There seems to be some similarities between this case and Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. We should remind our audience that McCarrick is the retired Archbishop of Washington, D.C., who was removed from public ministry over credible accusations of sexual abuse of a teenager more than 40 years ago. Edward, what is the likely fallout from today's resignation?
Well, I think questions are going to be asked now of the hierarchy in Honduras primarily, but also the Vatican, and they're going to be asked what they knew and when, and this particularly relates to Cardinal Rodriguez Maradiaga, because sources have told us that he was well aware of this that was going on, but did nothing to change it, and sided with Bishop Pineda against the facts that were shown to him. So whether that's true or not, we don't know, but certainly that's what we're hearing from Honduras, and it's really incumbent, people feel, on the Cardinal to clarify just what he knew and what steps will be taken, really, to make sure that Bishop Pineda is not put in a place where he can commit these abuses again.
Sex scandals have rocked the church in many parts of the world, and now we're seeing some action. In Chile, for example, all 31 active bishops have offered to resign after allegations of cover-up. Do you think all of this is a result of the Holy Father's push to reform the church?
Well, the Pope has certainly continued the reforms that Benedict implemented. He's continued a lot of the measures which had been put in place. But on the other hand, there has been criticism that he's been quite reactive, and that he's only reacted to these cases when they've come into the public sphere. For example, Honduras, but also there's the example of Chile, where the bishops there was a bishop accused of cover-up, and the Pope didn't really believe that allegation until presented with a letter, and even then he wasn't convinced. And then, of course, there's the issue, the case of Cardinal McCarrick, which has been going on for some years, and which many people knew about, but no action was taken until it made the newspapers.
Okay, well, there are a number of allegations out there, and certainly a number of cases that we're going to continue to cover. Edward Pinton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks, Edward.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up, fallout from the U.S.-Russia summit continues. And a Washington journalist weighs in on a busy week for the White House. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says meetings between the presidents of the United States and Russia should become normal again. This after President Trump invites Vladimir Putin to the White House this fall.
Ich finde, dass es wieder zur Normalität werden muss.
Merkel says that 90% of the world's nuclear weapons are in the hands of the U.S. and Russia, and for that reason alone, the two leaders should be talking. The Russian ambassador to the U.S. says the Kremlin has yet to formally respond to President Trump's invitation to Vladimir Putin, but he says his country is open to it. This follows the two-president summit in Finland on Monday. Joining me now is Matthew Continetti, editor of the Washington Free Beacon. Matthew, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Is President Trump's invitation to Putin to come to the White House next fall the best next step in this?
It's a next step. I think some people are wondering whether Vladimir Putin has done anything to merit a White House invitation, since there was nothing in the way of concessions, it seems, on the part of either President Putin or President Trump during their meeting in Helsinki. But President Trump clearly wants to continue this relationship, and so I think he figures the next step would be to have Putin in D.C. to continue these talks.
President Trump, of course, faces a firestorm of criticism this week surrounding this meeting with Putin, not just the meeting itself, but certainly the press conference that happened right afterwards, and then the clarification the next day about what he meant in terms of Russian interference. Is all of this going to have a lasting impact on the intelligence community and their relationship with the president?
Well, I think the president and the intelligence community already had a strained relationship going into the Helsinki summit. And the comments that President Trump made during the press conference between himself and President Putin probably did not much to help that. Of course, the few days since the press conference, President Trump and his administration have been walking back some of the statements he made during the press conference, and indeed even some of the statements he may have made in that private one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin, the substance of which we really still don't have a clear idea of what happened.
Sure, a lot of questions there. What about American voters? How has this played out with folks across America?
Right. Well, I think most American voters don't pay too much attention to foreign policy when we're in a time of peace and prosperity like we are today. And I think when you look at most polls, you find that the Republican Party continues to be highly supportive of President Trump. And so I think a lot of Trump supporters are unlikely to be moved one way or the other by what's happened over the course of the week. The problem, of course, is that the voters have their say every 2 years, and in the meantime, you have a government to run. And I think some of the statements that the president made, statements which he's been trying to correct since the meeting in Helsinki, those statements have caused problems within the American government.
Let's look at this from a Russian perspective, because a lot of Russians see this as a victory. Has President Trump been outplayed by Putin?
Well, it's hard to say because, you know, when we look at actually what happened substantively coming out of that meeting, it's not clear that President Trump gave anything up. I think President Trump is very open to discussion. And I think when he talks to people, especially in a one-on-one situation, he'll entertain a variety of ideas, but he never really commits to them. And so what we've seen in the days since the Helsinki summit is the American government having to say, no, that idea that was brought up in the one-on-one discussion, an idea like saying we're going to hand the former American diplomat to the Russian authorities, or we're going to allow a referendum to be conducted in eastern Ukraine. What the administration has been saying in the days since the meeting is those ideas aren't actually U.S. policy.
Okay. Before his summit, of course, President Trump attended a two-day meeting in NATO, and that, of course, got some controversy as well when it comes to criticizing NATO allies and pushing them to contribute more money. How important is NATO in defending Russia?
I know there's a lot of debate surrounding this topic, some of it started by the president himself. I personally believe that NATO continues to be instrumental to American deterrence. It's the idea of collective security, of building up a situation of strength, and creating a high cost for aggressive action that allows us to deter our adversaries, which unfortunately includes Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Okay, so a lot to think about, a lot to digest here, especially after this week. Matthew Continetti, editor of the Washington Free Beacon, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Up next, we discuss immigration and calls to abolish ICE. And a member of Japan's imperial family visits a Brazilian site important to Catholics. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The Trump administration says it has reunited 364 children, ages 5 and older, with their families after they were separated at the border. There are still hundreds of children to go before a court-imposed deadline of July 26th. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is one of the groups taking the lead on helping families that have been released into the U.S. Joining us now is Teresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Teresa, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Once these children are reunited with their parents, what happens to them?
Well, it kind of depends on where the parents are in their removal process. So if they, for example, are already been ordered removed or getting ready to be deported, they have a choice about whether or not their child would be deported with them, or the child can remain in the United States and pursue their own claims. The lawsuit that's going on right now over the separation of children, the plaintiffs have asked the court to hold off on those deportations to allow those parents to make an informed decision, because that's a big choice. They may be reunited, but it may be temporary. If the parents are pursuing their own asylum claim in the United States, the family may be released together into the United States under some sort of supervision by Immigration and Customs Enforcement until their hearing.
Your think tank recently conducted a survey on Americans' views on immigration, found 65% believe the U.S. immigration system is broken, and 69% support a path to legal status for immigrants who are here illegally. Why do you think Congress isn't acting, and what should be in a bill, in your view?
Well, I think a lot of members of Congress are sort of looking at the extremes of what can be done on immigration. Either it's all enforcement or complete amnesty. And what we found in our survey is Americans want a combination of both. They want a middle ground, and they want Congress to find that middle ground. So I think one of the things we have to look at with our legislators is how can we encourage them to find that middle ground and to not, for example, defeat a bill that doesn't meet everything they want if there's a lot of middle ground in it.
Another topic here when it comes to difference between Republicans and Democrats is whether they're going to have a bill that effectively either supports or goes against ICE, which is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. So obviously the Republicans have passed a sort of symbolic bill in support of it, but the Democrats seem to want to abolish ICE. Can that, again, aside from whether or not you support or not support ICE, do you think they can realistically abolish it?
I think that right now that's hashtag, it's a hashtag, it's not a real policy.
Okay.
And I think that there have been some on the left, particularly immigration advocates on the far left, that have been using this as a rallying cry, a protest point, if you will, against the Trump administration's enforcement policies. But as a real, sort of legislative priority, I think Democrats are wrestling with what does it mean? Does it really mean conduct more oversight? Does it really mean try to reconfigure how the agency does its job? I think the idea of actually abolishing ICE it probably has limited appeal. But Republicans, if you will, I think see an avenue to create a wedge for the midterms, and I think one of the reasons we had the symbolic vote yesterday, this week, was about that.
Mm-hmm. Your survey also shows Americans want action, but Congress may obviously not come up with a solution for immigration, not likely before the midterms. How do you think voters will respond to that? How big of an issue is this going to be?
Well, it's interesting. Immigration, not from our polls, but more recent polling has showed, has become a bigger issue for voters of late. They are saying that it is one of the more important issues that Congress should tackle. We have to remain to be seen how that impacts the individual votes in individual districts. Whether or not most Americans see immigration as the #1 priority that Congress must tackle or not, individual races are run in individual districts, and it's usually the issues that those voters care about most that determines who gets reelected. That having been said, I think there is a growing feeling that Congress is not doing anything on a lot of issues, immigration being one of them. Right. And so hopefully we might see some election of people who are willing to sort of make those deals happen and get some legislation passed.
Okay, we'll be watching to see what happens. Teresa Cardinal-Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Catholic priests in Buenos Aires, Argentina have opened a crisis pregnancy center to respond to the needs of women living in the slums. It's also a sign of the church's commitment to defend the unborn and their mothers. A bill legalizing abortion passed one of the country's governing bodies and is now being debated in Argentina's Senate. The Archdiocese of Dublin is seeking 4,000 Eucharist ministers to serve at the Mass Pope Francis will celebrate next month. The liturgy will end the World Meeting of Families. 500,000 free tickets have been claimed. And finally tonight, a member of Japan's royal family visits an iconic statue in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Princess Mako stopped by Christ the Redeemer, which stands nearly 100 feet high. Included in her official tour group was a Catholic priest. The visit marks 110 years of immigration from her country to Brazil. It is home to the largest Japanese diaspora in the world. The princess is on a 2-week tour of the majority Catholic country. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight and for this week. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We're back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night and God bless.